All right, I'm going to talk with a little water because I tend to get a little bit of dry mouth when I talk. So first, I really want to thank everyone who helped put the Spark Conference together. I know John DeRay has worked particularly hard, and when he asked me to be one of the keynote speakers, I felt really, really honored. As the new director of the first year program, I'm really excited because I get to work with a lot of the freshman students, and hopefully what I have to talk to you guys about tonight will hit home with some of you. So when I first started, when John first came to me and asked whether I would do this, he sort of said, we're focusing on vocation, we're focusing on identity, technology, so if you could, touch on one of those, that would be fantastic. And I, of course, said, I'm going to do my best to touch on all three. So I want to start tonight by telling you guys a little bit about how I went about putting this speech together. And I really started with the idea of identity. And I'm a professor of communication, and I teach classes about relationships. So I look at family relationships, I look at romantic relationships and friendships, and all the relationship dynamics that unfold within those contexts. So I really started to think about my family communication class that I teach, which is probably one of the favorites of some of my students, one that they come back and say they really remember or really influenced them over time. And one of the things that I talk about in that class is the importance of family stories, right? What purpose do family stories serve? So I started talking to my parents, who are actually here tonight, Bruce and Donna, over in the corner there. So for those of you who know me, you can wish them your condolences on the way out. But it's a small miracle that I'm even here tonight, so I'd like to thank them, of course. But we started talking about, I called and I asked my mom just some simple questions, like, what did you think I was going to be when I grew up, right? Or how are some of the ways that you viewed me as a little kid? And I started to reflect on some of those stories, right? So you guys all have stories that your family seems to tell about you over and over and over again, right? It's like the same story that you hear throughout your life, right? Over and over. You bring a new boyfriend or girlfriend home, and that story inevitably gets told, right? You bring anyone new into the house, the story gets told, right? And it serves a couple different functions, right? A referential function to maybe remind you of early events in your life, but certainly serves a belonging function, right? When people tell you stories about when you were little, maybe the day you were born, right? It serves a belonging function, that you belong in that family, that you're a part of that social group. And then also they serve an identity function, right? That help to shape in your early years who you become. So I started thinking about the stories that my parents tell, right? About when I was little. And there's a couple that come up over and over and over again. And when I started to think about vocation or calling or how I got to where I am today, I think some of those early stories really made a pretty big difference, right? So I guess when I think about the adjectives people might have used to describe me growing up, right? There were a couple that I would always hear. One was creative, right? I was a very creative child. So I was always playing make-believe and pretending I was a painter. Or perhaps I was one of the Lost Boys, as Peter Pan was one of my favorite movies, right? So one of my stories my dad will always tell is how I would watch Peter Pan and then I would tie myself up in the closet and pretend that I was one of the Lost Boys, right? Well, I still kind of think I'm one of those Lost Boys. So I started to think about some of those stories, right, about identity and who you are. And one thing that kind of was common among those stories is that I was definitely a child who experienced life through the five senses, right? I was very tactile. I loved to touch stuff. I was a little bit of a tomboy, right? So I was always making mud pies. I was very into smells. I was very into sounds. But definitely, probably those early roots of why I am sort of a scientist, right? I was using those observational methods of the scientific method pretty early on. So in terms of stories, one that my mother will always tell is about when I was really, really little, right? I absolutely loved caterpillars. I thought they were the most amazing animals, and I would always go and find them. We lived in the woods, right? We had lots of trees with the caterpillar tents. And I just had a thing for not just caterpillars, but all animals. I loved them since as long as I can remember. And I was always trying to quote unquote save little baby animals, right? So I saved plenty of baby bunnies from probably their perfectly safe nest, right? I saved lots of baby birds along the way, which my parents would then find like in my closet. So I was like an early nurturer. The nature and nurture debate is something that was always pretty prevalent in my life. And so my mom would tell these stories about how I would get these caterpillars, and I would take like a mason jar, one of those glass jars, and I would put some leaves in it, and I would put some sticks in it, and I would create this little home for these caterpillars, and I wanted them to make sure they had food, right? And those glass jars really provided that like 360-degree view of like that poor caterpillar's existence, right? Who I'd inevitably trapped in some glass jar that was probably not going to make it to its butterfly stage, to put it mildly, right? So I was always caring for things. I was always nurturing things as a little kid. So I think that's something that sort of feeds into eventually what I became, right? But I was also very tactile. Another story my mom will tell is Sunday in church, right? All these women would wear fur coats, and I was always petting them. Always, right? And this isn't really something that changed over time. My boyfriend Jason is also here tonight, and I think on our first date, we were at a festival, and I got some pine sap on my fingers, and his first reaction was like, oh, let's wipe that off, it's sticky and gross. And I was like, no, smell it, it smells like pine, right? So I'm still really taking in the world through those five senses. I think also as a child, I was one that didn't really like boundaries of any sort. So I was crawling out of my crib before I could walk. My parents would wake up in the morning and find that I had gotten into the childproof cabinets, right, which were no match for me, and taken things like peanut butter or soft scrub or bleach, right, spread them all over the new floor, the new wallpaper, right? So another common adjective that I would hear used to describe me is mischievous, right? It's mischievous. So I was a busy kid, didn't like boundaries. Another thing they'll probably tell you, it was hard to keep me clothed until about the second grade. So I'm a nature girl, right? Love the animals, love the great outdoors, the smell of pine, and just didn't like being bound or constricted by any sort of parameters, which is pretty interesting because I'm a social scientist who uses statistics, and now I'm constantly bound by parameters, right, in my research. So a little bit of irony there to be found. But as I started growing up, right, I was never really one of those kids who knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. I didn't really have these aspirations to like be a doctor or a lawyer. I didn't really want to grow up, right? I had this sort of Peter Pan mentality that was forever young, right? So as I started to develop, another word that I think people would use to describe me is actually shy, which for those of you who know me today probably don't believe it to save your life. But I was actually a pretty shy kid, and I wasn't really comfortable stepping outside of my comfort zone. So when it came to trying things that were new or foreign or unknown, I would often quit before I even got the chance to succeed. And that's something that was a story that would come up time and time again, is that I'd like to stay in my comfort zone. I'd like to stay places where I was safe. And that was pretty true, I would say, until graduate school, right? So growing up, I went through a couple of different phases. And I think because of my early love of animals and my continued love of animals, right? Everyone kept saying like, oh, you're gonna be a vet, for sure. Like you're cut out for veterinary medicine. But when I talked to my mom a couple of weeks ago, she said, yeah, people would say that, but we actually thought you were a little too tender-hearted for that, which I think translates to you wouldn't be able to put animals to sleep, right? So I've sort of passed that phase. And then in middle school, I was really into politics, right? My parents were both pretty politically involved, knew a lot about history, government, so politics was always sort of a theme in my family. And around the '88 election, right, many of you probably weren't born then, but it was the Bush-Dukakis election of '88, and I was in 6th grade, and at that point I thought, you know, I'm going to be president, right? And who knows, maybe one day. But, so I sort of went through these different phases, right? And then I was in high school thinking, oh, it's time to apply to college. And I didn't really know what to do. You know, my brother seemed to know he wanted to be an engineer. My sister was very social, so she was sort of cut out for PR and marketing. But I didn't really have that kind of place. So I just stayed in school. I started out my undergraduate degree at Michigan State, and that's where both my parents went to school, so I has a little bit of a legacy there. And those were probably some of the roughest years of my life from a developmental standpoint, right? I made more mistakes during the period of like 17 to 22 than most likely everyone in this room combined could probably make if they tried their hardest. So when you ask my father, he'll probably tell you, he's just happy I'm not in prison, right? So if you were to ask him where I might have ended up, he might have said as like a real life star on Orange is the New Black, right? Which I don't necessarily know if he actually knows what that show's about, but in his eyes that's probably where I was gonna end up. So late in my undergraduate career, I transferred to the University of Arizona, which is really where I started to find myself and my passion and my calling. And I think how that happened was, you know, in 10th grade, I was really obsessed with biology and genetics. So I was pretty sure, like, I was gonna be a geneticist, right? That was it. But my dad kept telling me, your math and science grades just aren't that great, right? Which was true, all right? Now I teach statistics, so go figure, karma, right? So early in my career at University of Arizona, I just started listening, right, to how other people described me or what I was good at. And I had a graduate teaching associate named Pamela Cook, who I worked with my senior year in undergrad. And one day she just said to me, listen, you really should go to graduate school. And I was like, wait a minute. Like I can stay in college? This was a dream, right? It was like I could live the Peter Pan reality and never grow up. And I was pretty good at school. I never really had to try hard to do well in school. I think one time I told my mother that I didn't need to go to class because I would do better on the exams than the students that did go to class. That's pretty true. So I had intelligence on my side, right? But it was really kind of looking back. I never really had a direction or a path or a calling per se that I thought I was going to follow. It just sort of unfolded in a natural progression. So I started out grad school in political communication, thinking, of course, I'm going to be a speechwriter or I'm going to be a press secretary, because now I was, you know, in communication, so that's what political comm people did. And all of a sudden it just hit me, like I have zero interest in politics, none whatsoever. What I was really interested in were the interpersonal dynamics that went on during political debates. So I love the attack advertising, I love the smear campaigns. I can tell you about the Dukakis tank ad, which many of you may have learned about if you've taken political science classes or political communication classes. But I just kept going into college, and eventually I was like, oh, I could be a professor. And that just means I get to stay in college, right? For about the rest of my life. So far that plan's going pretty good. And one of the things that we teach in communication, and some of you may be familiar with this concept, is the idea of Cooley's looking glass self. Has anyone ever heard of that concept before? Can I call on you? Do you know what it is? You don't want to talk about it? This is my professor note. What? I'm the expert? All right, perfect. Well, Cooley's looking glass self is basically a concept that there is no self-concept without the other. So you only really gauge your sense of self by understanding how other people see you and how other people relate to you. So when it comes to something like vocation or calling, it's often something that you have to look in retrospect to find. What have people told you across your lifetime that is consistent about the way you act, your strengths, what you're good at, perhaps what your weaknesses are? And only after reflecting upon those things are you really going to come to understand what your best qualities are. So, again, fast forward a little bit. 10th grade, loved genetics. Loved like animals, right? When I was little, it was all about nature and nurture and taking care of animals. Well, halfway through my master's degree, I actually realized humans, in fact, are animals, right? So what I found myself doing is at the age of 37, I'm still sort of caring for those wounded birds, or those baby bunnies, right? But they just come in the form of college students who are in a very formative time of their life between the ages of 18 and 22, which is a really crucial developmental time in terms of you guys understanding your sense of self, who you are, and what you're good at, right? So only after I heard that I was creative and a little mischievous, and for those of you who don't know me, I kind of study the dark side of communication. So I like looking at things like jealousy and aggression and envy, and some of the darker behaviors, I suppose. So probably where that mischievousness factored in just a little bit. But when I started to think about, why is it I became a professor, I started to think about evolution, right? So I started to think about those classes in genetics, and right now I'm teaching a class in evolutionary psychology. And one of the things that we talk about is the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. If any of you guys have ever taken a class, maybe with Dr. Phillips here at Wittenberg, or any classes in evolution, you've probably talked about that. And it's really the idea that the environment that you're born into, or that you're raised in, or that you develop in, is essential in forming aspects of your personality and aspects of yourself that deal with who you're going to become. So I started reflecting on those, what was my early environmental adaptiveness that I was sort of exposed to early on? And a lot of it was college. So when I was little, my parents have a good friend, Dennis Severance, who was a professor at University of Michigan. So a lot of my weekends as a child were spent going to football games, and we're definitely house divided. We're a Michigan State household. But a lot of football games, and I would always see Dennis, who was a professor, to the T, right, like the tweed jacket. And it was always just a really comfortable environment for me. So as I grew up, I would watch my parents. They all went on to get advanced degrees, and still, as senior citizens, continue to do things. Hey, they look young. They're young senior citizens, right? To continue their education. I know, right? Am I giving you a roast? This is what I've gotten for 37 years, so this is payback perhaps, right? So, I started thinking about how much that probably influenced me. The fact that I really loved the college environment, that I really loved the age of college students. And so I find it really no accident that what I ended up studying was romantic relationships, which are pretty prevalent in your extended adolescence, which is kind of where you guys are now. So again, no intentional plan. And I think if you ask people sort of where I am today and how I got there, they would probably tell you they didn't know, and they're pretty surprised that I am where I am. And I'm really not that surprised, because it's those people who ended up putting me here by telling me who I was during those 20 or 25 formative years of my life. So I've spent the last couple of years, my expertise is in interpersonal relationships, interpersonal communication. And what I'm really looking at now is the influence of social media on interpersonal relationships. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Skype, Instagram. and really looking at the potential for those social technologies to influence our interpersonal relationships. And I think a lot of people have the perspective that technology is bad, right? And that it's deteriorating interpersonal relationships. But when I was home over the summer, my niece and nephew were there, they're 15 and 16, and my nephew's a big gamer, right? So he lives on his computer, he's always playing video games. And of course, my first instinct is to say, why isn't he relating to people his age? And then I started eavesdropping, right? Because dark side of communication, my master's thesis was on gossip. So I started eavesdropping on his gaming, right? And I was actually really surprised to find that he's engaging in a lot of really good skills. He's learning how to negotiate, he's learning how to bargain, he's learning how to cooperate, he's learning how to compete. So I think sometimes we give technology a little bit of a bad rap, right? And technology is something that humans have always dealt with, we've always faced. And it's something that we're going to continue to adapt to. What makes us different as a species is that we're going to direct our own evolution as a function of our technology, which is something that we're really starting to see if you look at things like virtual reality, or if any of you are familiar with Oculus Rift. We start to see virtual technologies that are being created by people that are your age, right? Oculus Rift is a virtual reality machine that's created by Palmer Luckey, who's 21 years old, and just sold it for billions, right? So technology probably isn't as evil as some people may say. Gary talked a little bit about that. But when I was really thinking, something that you guys might be able to relate to in terms of vocation or calling, I always hear people say, I need to find my calling. I need to find what I'm good at. And when we're trying to find things, we're often using our eyes. But when you need to find what you're good at or what your calling is, you actually need to listen and use your ears. And a lot of times that happens sort of post hoc. So I wanted to close with a quote from you guys, right? From Mr. Ollivander. You guys know who he is? Mr. Ollivander. Who is he? He's from Harry Potter, right? Yes, he worked at the wand store, right? So he said, the wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter. It's not always clear why. And I really think that vocation and calling works the same way. So as hard as you may try to find it and to locate it and to pinpoint it and to follow your passions and your interests, oftentimes that's not really how it works. Your career path, your calling, is absolutely going to find you, right? And just like Mr. Ollivander said to Mr. Potter, I think it's clear that we can expect great things from all of you. Thank you.